Hello, and you're very welcome to another edition of AgriFocus. Farmers are constantly hearing that land management has a key role to play in fighting climate change in Ireland. But what does that mean in reality, particularly in relation to EU rules on land use change and forestry? And how can we measure the contribution that this sector is making in fighting climate change? The Environment Protection Agency is responsible for compiling the inventories of greenhouse gas emissions for Ireland and reporting to the relevant European and international institutions. And joining me today on AgriFocus is Dr Eimear Cotter, Director of Evidence and Assessment with the EPA. Eimear, how can the land use sector in Ireland play an important role in fighting climate change?
The land sector has a hugely important role to play in terms of climate action, and that's really in terms of its ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and store that carbon. So in Ireland, our land sector, our land use change and forestry, the LULUCF sector, that's a source of emissions in Ireland. It actually emits more greenhouse gas emissions than it absorbs from the atmosphere. So what we need to see happen is the sinks, so forestry, for example, our wetlands, to make sure they're operating effectively, they're restored, rehabilitated. We need those sinks to be enhanced, and those areas that are actually emitting emissions from land, like grasslands, like degraded peatlands, we need to see those emissions reduced so that overall land is actually storing and absorbing as much carbon as we can get from the atmosphere and reducing the amount of emissions as much as possible.
And that's particularly important in light of the update last year to land use change and forestry regulation, which introduced an enhanced target to increase land-based net removals in the EU by an additional 42 million tonnes of CO2 by 2030.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen in recent years the LULUCF sector, so our land sector, really coming into the fore because it is now coming into compliance targets at an EU level. So we have targets for land use change and forestry at an EU level, and they filter into individual member state targets. And that has driven renewed focus on the land area, how we estimate emissions, and has driven a lot of research to improve our understanding of what's actually happening in our land area in relation to emissions.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about how emissions are measured in Ireland and why this is important?
So in the LULUCF sector, we have, first of all, that's made up of 6 primary land use categories. So there's forestry, wetlands, grasslands, croplands, settlements, and then there's a small other category. So there's 6 individual land use categories within the LULUCF sector. And really overall what we're doing is measuring the carbon stock changes within those 6 areas to overall give a picture of what's happening in our land. So for grasslands, for example, we're using national statistics from the CSO on the area of grasslands in the country. We couple that with information about the soils that are underlying the grasslands and feeding in research where that's coming through. And then also using Irish-specific emission factors that let us calculate, based on the carbon stock changes, what are the emissions coming from those sectors. And overall, how we calculate the emissions is done according to international rules and guidelines that are set down by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Okay. And what is the LULUCF data telling us just at the moment?
So LULUCF overall is a net source of emissions in Ireland. So it emits more greenhouse gas emissions than it actually absorbs. And that has been the case going back over the full reporting period, going back from 1990 to 2022. So for the most recent year, which is 2022, for which we have data, the LULUCF sector overall emitted 4 million tonnes into the atmosphere. So that's about 6% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a sizable contribution of our total greenhouse gas emissions in the country. So within that, you'll have a significant sink from forestry. Forestry absorbed about 1.5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. But counteracting that then is emissions that are coming off grasslands and coming off peatlands, for example. So overall, net, we have an emission of 4 million tonnes in 2022.
And how do we compare it to the rest of Europe?
So we are unusual in the rest of Europe in terms of our land area being a source of emissions. Other countries in the EU would have much higher afforestation, much higher forestry sinks. But we compare with the Netherlands and Denmark, who also see emissions coming from their land area like we do. And that's really a large part of our emissions from the land sector are driven by our grasslands, and those grasslands in particular that are based on organic and peaty soils. So where we've seen those lands being drained for agricultural production over the years, that drainage is exposing the vulnerable carbon within those soils. When it's exposed to air, it's actually accelerating its decomposition, and then we're seeing a high amount of emissions coming off those particular grasslands. So that's really driving a large part of our emissions from land, and also in addition, the degradation of our peatlands that we've seen over many years as a result of large-scale peat extraction, which has stopped now, but will take time to actually restore and rehabilitate those peatlands so that they actually start functioning more effectively in terms of a carbon sink.
And there's lots of scientific research now taking place on this, isn't there, in Ireland?
Huge amount of research, and that really been driven by an increased recognition that land has a really important role to play. And also that what I mentioned earlier there, the piece around land and the targets being set at EU level and the compliance around that really driving interest from researchers. So we're seeing a lot of research coming to the fore, in particular last year, really good research coming through and published research on the drainage status of grasslands on peaty organic soils. That has been now been fed into the greenhouse gas inventory, and Irish-specific information on emission factors so that we get a better handle on what the CO2 emissions are from these types of land areas. So this research, when it's published, peer-reviewed scientific research, we take it up immediately and work it into the inventory, and so that we're constantly improving and evolving how we're accounting for emissions. And that's standard for all sectors of the economy. That's what's expected of us as the competent authority for putting together our greenhouse gas emissions. And the LULUCF sector is just one that is particularly dynamic at the moment because of all that research that is coming through.
We often hear, that farmers should listen to the science. They should listen to the black and white figures that they're hearing. So is it important that farmers take on board what the data is now telling us?
It is really important, and like it gives an understanding of what's actually happening within the land area. Like, as I've said a few times there, our land is a source of emissions in Ireland. I don't think that's really widely understood. When you think of land, you perhaps think more first of all around the fact that it actually absorbs and stores carbon from the atmosphere, and it does that. But there are the countervailing pressures from, for example, grasslands, peatlands, that overall leads us to a situation where we have a net emission from land. So understanding the different dynamics that are going on and what is a complex system can help in terms of driving action into the future. And as we see in terms of the ambition that's in the Climate Action Plan, for example, for our land sector.
And what is the grassland figure for the 2024 inventory?
So grassland is one aspect of the LULUCF sector, but in 2022, grasslands was responsible for 2.5 million tonnes of emissions. That number was, we put those figures together based on new research that came through last year, giving us a much better understanding of what the drainage status of grasslands on organic peaty soils is in the country. So that enabled us to feed that research through and to get a more accurate estimate of what's happening on grasslands. So it's responsible for 2.5 million tonnes of emissions in 2022. That's just over 60% of the total land use emissions. So it is a sizable amount of emissions, and that really been driven by the grasslands that are based on peaty organic soils.
And does the research point us to the potential associated with measures that can reduce emissions?
Certainly, there is a lot of research in that area. A lot of it brought together now in terms of the Climate Action Plan that was just finalised in the last number of weeks, and a lot of ambition built in there for the land sector. So looking at enhanced afforestation rates. So the ambition is to have afforestation up at 8,000 hectares every year. That's a significant jump. It will be a significant challenge. We're now at about 2,000 hectares a year. But also looking at, for example, those grasslands, particularly those on organic soils, how could the intensity of how they're managed be reduced, be it from reduced fertiliser use, looking at water table management, manipulation. The research will really feed into that and will help advisors like Teagasc, for example, and their engagement with farmers. And then also looking at peatlands. Our peatlands are severely degraded as a result of large-scale peat extraction. So looking at the restoration, the rehabilitation of those peatlands and what that actually means for emissions, all of that being supported by research. So it is a really active area. And as that research comes through and as it's published, we then take it into the inventory to ensure that we're constantly developing our inventory as we go.
Do you think that it will mean a change in how we farm in Ireland? Because I know there's been so much focus with regards to peatlands and what the kind of direction that we're going in that. And we know that's a European-wide initiative too.
I mean, if you look at what's in the Climate Action Plan, there are significant targets, be it around afforestation, the management of our grasslands, the move to tillage, for example, organic farming. There's a very active conversation at the moment around diversification in farming and what that actually looks like and what that means. I think we're still figuring that out. There isn't the detail yet from our perspective in the EPA to be able to understand what diversification actually means in terms of emissions. And that's what we'll ultimately be looking at from our side. So that's still being worked through at the moment. But certainly a lot of options being set out for farmers who will need to engage with it, who will need to be supported in however this evolves.
I was going to ask you about that, how important it is to bring farmers on this journey.
Oh, it's hugely important. I mean, we're hugely reliant on farmers, particularly in the land sector, also in the agricultural sector, of course, but in the land sector, it is delivery and implementation of these measures that are, for example, set out in the Climate Action Plan is hugely reliant on farmers' engagement. It will ultimately be their decision what happens to their land. But learning from farmers who are the closest to their own land is absolutely critical.
And it is part of the transition, isn't it? We talk about moving to a more green-based economy, and we've been asking farmers to do this, but it is a challenge too, isn't it, to kind of look at where you're going in the future compared to where you currently are today?
It is a challenge, and we're all grappling with that as we look at climate change, and we see what we all need to do, be it at an individual level, community level, businesses, and the farming sector as well. So it's about all of us being able to engage with that. Every sector playing their part in it. It's not about a blame game or looking at one sector in particular, but every sector having a role to play in tackling our emissions, which overall need to come down.
And we have seen some positive examples of how that can work in practice.
Yeah, there are positive examples. We see that in water quality. A lot of initiatives are happening now in terms of tackling our water. We haven't seen that come through in the results as yet, but hopefully in time. We do see positive work happening on restoring our peatlands as well. I mean, large-scale extraction of peat in terms of commercial extraction has ceased now. And those peatlands are being restored and rehabilitated by Board na Móna. So that's hugely positive. So where there's a will, there is a way. And it's just really about being focused about what we want to see happen and make sure then that the relevant stakeholders, be it the farming community, be it the forestry sector, be it Board na Móna, when we're looking at the land use areas, that each are brought with us on the journey.
And is this a nationwide issue, or does it apply to more specific areas in the country?
Well, it's nationwide really, because within the land sector there are 6 primary land use categories. So that's going right through from forestry, wetlands, grasslands, croplands. So it will affect the whole country. And really it's about understanding what is the primary land use in your area, what are the issues, and then moving forward there, then from within that with action. So I can't, it'll be a particular part of the country will be facing particular challenges, but it's understanding that really from the get-go and then targeting the measures that need to happen after that.
And the targets for 2030 for LULUCF, 2030 isn't really that far away anymore. So it is going to be quite the challenge for farmers to embrace this and move forward in Ireland. And
we do see that we've just recently in the EPA published our greenhouse gas emission projections, which show that the land sector is projected to continue to be a source of emissions out to 2030. we can moderate those emissions with actions as have been set out in the climate action plan. So we can certainly can see improvements in terms of the level of emissions coming from the sector with implementation of those actions, be it forestry, be it grassland management, looking at the restoration of our peatlands. But certainly many of the measures that we will take in the land sector will deliver post 2030 and out into 2040, 2050. So it is a longer game, if you like, in the land area, but that's every reason to start now with it so we can start reaping those benefits in the future.
And it will come down to land management. That's going to be the crucial aspect of it all, isn't it?
Yes, and that's ultimately those decisions will lie with the major stakeholders, be it farmers, be it the forestry sector, Board na Móna I've mentioned. So it is ultimately will be their decision, having the right information in front of them, engaging with them, and for us and in the EPA, ultimately understanding what do those actions, what is that land management delivering in terms of emission reductions, and that research piece that we've talked about, really important then that we're capturing that activity, that the data that's been generated actually feeds back into the inventory, which is a really strong focus for us and will continue to be in the land area.
And it's important that farmers are supported to make this transition, isn't it? You know, we talk about financial supports, but also the infrastructure supports that need to be put in place in order to achieve those targets.
Absolutely. I mean, every sector needs support, and the agricultural sector needs support as well. There are large scale changes being asked of the sector. Again, if you look through the climate action plan, there's a lot of ambition being built in there. And I think this is recognised that the agriculture sector will need to be supported. So how that happens really will be for the policy system and government to figure that out. But we have significant targets to reach by 2030. The agricultural sector, as every sector, will have to play their role in doing that, and how that's actually delivered. We really need to start grappling with that now. We can see from our projections that while we can get, under the best case scenario, 29% reduction in emissions by 2030, that still leaves us short of the 51% where we're supposed to be. So really we need to make sure that every sector is moving at pace and delivering at scale.
And how can government agencies and government organisations reassure farmers that it isn't something to fear, that there is going to be the basis for farming in Ireland and it will continue?
Well, from the EPA's perspective, it's really about highlighting and showcasing those good stories when they come through. So we need to have the information of when farmers are taking action, when they're delivering improvements in the environment, be it in terms of emissions, be it in terms of water quality, that we are able to connect that activity with what's happening in the environment. And that's all about getting data and getting information back to us in the EPA at a generalised scale. You know, we're not looking at individual farmers, we're looking at this from a generalised level. So for us in the EPA, it's about being able to tell those good news stories. And when there is good news, being communicating that good news. We recently had a reduction in ammonia emissions for 2022, and that we were reporting that on the basis of changing farming practices in the agricultural sector. So there's no there's no agenda where the data is coming through, where we're seeing the improvements in the environment. We will be reporting it. To date, we haven't seen it in water quality, and the projections for our greenhouse gas emissions, which overall, not just for agriculture but for the country overall, are leaving us short of where we've committed to be at 51% reduction on 2030.
So lots more debate to come on the whole issue of LULUCF. But for today, we're going to say thank you to Dr Eimear Cotter, Director of Evidence and Assessment with the Environment Protection Agency, for joining us today on AgriFocus. And if you get the chance to rate, review and follow AgriFocus on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from, we'd appreciate that. We look forward to catching up with you again very soon.